We have 3 announcements this morning, starting with Nicholas Preheim for SAC, I think.
Thank you. So first of all, tonight is Dine at 9 candy bar, so come with a sweet tooth. That's at 9, of course. Then tomorrow, SAC and the Pre-Health Professionals Club are joining together for Walking Tacos and Concussion, the movie. And that will be tomorrow in the projection room at 8. Then this Friday, we have do-it-yourself pizza night from 9:30 to 11 in the CAF, so that's going to be really yummy. Come hungry to that. Sometime today, you should be receiving an email from Gabe about we're doing Volleyball Madness during Winter Week, but we're doing pre-registration for teams, so that email will be coming out sometime today. So look for that. And there's some information about how many people you can have on each team. And then finally, so we haven't had anybody actually turn in punch cards for this semester, so we're going to carry that on over to the next semester. Make sure you're bringing your punch cards to events so we can do the drawing for the iPad.
Okay, and Joanna Bieram is going to tell us about Glad You're Here.
Good morning, friends. Hi. Hopefully by now you've seen around campus these posters, and I wanted to just sort of explain what was going on with them. So the Office of Student Wellness, me, I decided that we would take the 21 days before Thanksgiving and see if we could do a little bit of a happiness challenge. So it will begin Wednesday and wrap up right before we leave for Thanksgiving. It's sort of taken from the TED Talk by Sean Acor. So if you're like super interested in it, you can look that up on TED.com. You'll like it. But the premise is that our minds work better on positive than on negative, neutral, or stressed, because the dopamine floods your brain and it makes you happier, yes, but it also turns on your learning centers, which we all need at this point in the semester, right? So there'll be a few concrete ideas coming through, and it'll all come through the Bethel app. So if you haven't downloaded the app yet, please do it, because that's where the notifications for all of these things will come. So keep your eye open for that. The other thing I want to tell you about is that I'm also working with Residence Life to offer bedtime yoga at 9:30 every Monday in November. So it'll be in the ad building 212. Barb Thiessen is going to do the instruction, and it'll be a lovely way to move your body so you can get some good rest, because that's part of being happier too. So hopefully you'll see a lot less janky energy on campus because of all this. So good luck.
And Lucas, did you make it here? No, he didn't. All right. Why don't we go ahead and show the video clip anyway?
Here we have a quiet little motel, when in fact it has now become known as the scene of the crime.
You have a vacancy?
Oh, we have 12 vacancies.
You know, this is the first place that looks like it's hiding from the world.
I think that we're all in our private traps, clamped in them. And none of us can ever get out.
Is anyone at home?
Oh, that must be my mother.
Is anything wrong?
Am I acting as if there's something wrong?
She's not missing so much as she's run away.
Put me down.
Mother! Oh, God! Mother!
What are you running away from?
She looked like a wrong one to you?
It's not as if she were a maniac. She just goes a little mad sometimes.
Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
Okay, so Clio, the History Club, is sponsoring a showing of Psycho tonight at 10:30 in celebration of Halloween in the MLA projection room, and there will be free pizza and soda. And certainly, if you've not seen Psycho, it is a film classic and lots of references to it in popular culture. You'll never want to take a shower again, but okay. Anyway. All right, so this morning we have our Menno Simons lecture, and the Menno Simons lecture series is an endowed lecture series that brings in specialists that are well-versed in Mennonite history and culture to give a series of public lectures, and Convocation is included in that grouping. So this year, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Perry Bush from Bluffton University. He is a professor of history there, originally from Pasadena, California, so big geographical change. He did his undergraduate degree at Berkeley and his graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. And before we welcome him to the podium, I would welcome you to turn off your cell phones and put them away, please. Remember, away means in a pocket or in a backpack, not laying on your leg where you are tempted to look at them. And I need hoods and hats down and off, earbuds out of your ears, please. Remember our engagement guidelines. And Dr. Bush is a college professor, so he's going to call you out on it if I don't. Okay, so welcome Dr. Perry Bush, please.
Good morning. Happy Halloween. It's hard to follow Alfred Hitchcock. Listen, I appreciate being here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate this chance to speak to Bethel students. I appreciate the Hitchcock. You know, we're a week away from Election Day, right? And it seems like a good segue into Election Day, given the fact that how many of us, the point of this seems to have been to frighten many of us, right? And I don't know about you, but I have found that, I mean, this one more than others, an entirely demoralizing election season. Very dispiriting, and I'm ready to have it done. I'm tired of the name calling. I'm tired of the endless charges, counter charges. I'm tired of worrying about the polls. And I'm really worried about what it means for our country after Election Day. I'm worried for what it portends, for what was once a shared American commitment to protect something that was bigger than any of us, a common good that was bigger than any of us. And I'm not a political scientist, but I think we've done immense damage these last months to the common good, and a lot of the bile that's emerged and the poison that's been injected into our body politic is not going to go away, all right? I'm not, again, a theologian. I'm not a political scientist. I like to wrestle with that stuff. I'm a social historian by training, and I've spent a lot of time in the past 25 years working in the very small but dynamic subfield of Mennonite history. And I want to come at the common good through that angle. And what I want to do is explore ways in which Mennonites have come up with an answer to this question of where we say yes and no to the state. And look, I teach at a college that is associated with the Mennonite College of USA. It's your sister school in Ohio. Most of our students are not at all Mennonites. In fact, we go at 10% of Bluffton student body are Mennonites. And so I do want to address all of you, right? I was invited to give the Menno Simons lecturers, and I can't, I got to talk about Mennonites, so bear with me, right? That's what I do, right? And that's the lecture topic. But I'm hoping, here's my pitch to you folks from other traditions, right? And come from a variety of traditions here at Bethel, make this such a rich and interesting place to be. Really, these questions are questions that anybody who's religious has to struggle with, right? What it is to be in the world but not of the world. How do we maintain basic group beliefs while remaining deeply immersed in wider society? Those are issues that any Christian and anybody who's religious, Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Muslims, Orthodox Baha'i, they have to wrestle with. How do we be believers and interact daily with non-believers, and how do we maintain our basic group beliefs while not sequestering ourselves away on islands? Okay, so that's my pitch for why it's worthwhile paying attention. And you know, I make my living as a college professor. I make my living addressing people like you. Well, usually not with a mic. And so I want to proceed the same way that your professors do. I'm going to try to do this in an engaged question-answer format. I'm going to have questions for you along the way to try to see if we can do this together. I'm just not going to, I'd prefer not to just talk endlessly at you, right? I know that this is a bigger crowd than your normal classes. I know it's a bit intimidating to shout out answers amidst a lot of your peers. So if answers aren't forthcoming, I'm just going to move on, all right? But at least fair one, I'm not going to try to embarrass any of you, but that's how at least I'll try to proceed. Let me begin with the title slide here. This is a little demonstration that my family, a couple of my kids are up there, and my spouse, and a few of us did the day after Thanksgiving at the Walmart in Lima, Ohio, calling attention to Walmart's long history of unfair labor practices. And my friend and Bluffton colleague Paul Weaver put out a press release, which got him on, the press showed up that day, which got him on TV. I think the Bluffton PR department would have wished he didn't wear a Bluffton University sweatshirt that day when he was on the news, but we did reach thousands of people beyond the 10 people we saw at Walmart at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I think this is a good way to plunge us into some key issues that we need to talk about, namely, in what ways do we Christians engage in public witness for peace and justice, and in particular, again, because of my focus, Mennonites, and how do we speak to the common good, and how do we rationalize doing that? So I want to begin, again, give me a break here, I'm not a theologian, all right, but a little bit of theology, all right? All right. You can see we enlisted Santa that day, too. And folks, just give me some examples. What advice do we tell the state? You ever written a letter to your congressperson, your senator, governor, right? What kind of advice, what kind of prescriptions do we levy onto the state? You ever written a letter? Yes. Okay, thank you. Give me examples of things we told the state what to do. Ask them to vote on this way or that way in a certain bill. Fund libraries, excellent. We need funding for libraries. You cut the funding for libraries, cut the funding for schools, we have lesser quality institutions, thank you. Any other examples?
To bring the issue of capital punishment.
Right, capital punishment, geez, Elizabeth Rage, you're ahead of me. Yeah, don't use the death penalty. All right, fair enough, all right, and push us further. There you go. We, at Bluffton, every time the state of Ohio executes someone, and it hasn't done in several years, not because they've been moved against it, but because they can't get enough drugs from the Norwegians, right? And that's put a crimp in our ability to kill people in Ohio. We in Bluffton would rally around, we would hold my first Mennonite church, the Mission, Peace, and Service Commission of my church would hold a little rally in downtown Public Square in downtown Bluffton, Ohio, to rally against the death penalty. That's not us, that's another, but we would hold up signs, and great example. We would tell the state what to do, right? So how do you rationalize doing that? Why should the state listen to you? You know, it's a secular state. It operates by different values in the kingdom of God. And we know what the Bible says. We read the Bible. You know what Romans 13 says. God's established the powers. And we're called to obey those authorities. And the person in power, of course, he, at the time, was God's servant. Right? If you did anything wrong, you don't really need trouble. But God's established the authorities to maintain order in the wicked world. So where do we get off telling the state what to do? Now, I'd say, and that gave you a short, brief bio of me. I was in college at Berkeley in the early 80s, and I became deeply involved in the Christian-based anti-nuclear movement, the Nuclear Freeze. I was part of an intentional Christian community. We did all these actions at the nuclear weapons planning plant. My alma mater was responsible for planning the next generation of nukes. University of California operates the weapons lab out at Livermore, so we would do actions out there. We would do actions out at the Lockheed plant down in Sunnyvale, where they made the Trident missile, and we'd be passing out leaflets to the workers as they drove in that day, asking them, please not to use nukes. Don't build these weapons. Weapons, we'd say, are sin. When you build a weapon that can incinerate millions of children, then in fact what you're saying to the state is that whatever rationale you construct is idolatry. It's sin to build these weapons. Nuclear weapons, if they're ever used, would make what Hitler did look like child's play. And we would, we oftentimes go on Christian days. We would go on Good Friday, and we would spread ashes around the facilities. And all through the back of my mind as we did this, I was wrestling, I'm thinking to myself, okay, this makes sense, and it's all very moving, and we're singing hymns, and it's clearly Christian-based, and we're passing out the leave. And I don't know if the workers appreciated them. I don't know if our actions were very effective. We would get interesting hand signals back from the workers as they drove into the plant, and, ASL. And, but I'd think to myself, why should these people listen to me? I have a different ethic than they do. From their perspective, it may make perfect sense to build nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't think the people who built these things are moral monsters, even though I was convinced then, I'm convinced now that the possession of those genocidal weapons is immoral, it's sin. But from, you come out of the historical trajectory that led us into World War II and the Manhattan Project, and yeah, they do, an aggressive state will nuke us unless we nuke them first, another capacity and deterrence and mutually assured destruction, mad, right? I understood all that. And from their perspective, it made sense to build nukes or to put people to death, wrongdoers to death, right? This is before we had DNA testing, and we can only shudder now with the number of innocent people who've been put to death at our hands. And even if they're not innocent, I have a different theological trajectory that says that we still, don't kill people. Why should the state listen to me? I thought to myself. Right? I'm a citizen of a different kingdom, God's kingdom. By our ethics in that realm, we don't need or want nuclear weapons or the death penalty or ship arms to prop up authoritarian governments in El Salvador. We were also protesting out of Port Chicago up in the Antioch, up in the Delta, where they were shipping arms to prop up the authoritarian states in Guatemala and El Salvador. They were engaging massive death squads. But these people I'm talking to aren't Christians. Why should they listen to me? I have a different ethic than they do. Where do I get off prescribing Christian ethics to the non-Christian world? Ironically, it wasn't until a half dozen later, and I was in grad school. I ended up doing a dissertation on Mennonites, and I discovered Mennonite reasoning along the same lines. This was the gist of traditional Mennonite non-resistance, two-kingdom theology, and which explained to me, historically at least, why Mennonites had not been very involved in maintaining the common good, right? That the Mennonites inherited this long historical trajectory. They'd inherited from Anabaptist ancestors whom the state had put to death in large numbers. And basically they said that, we're government, they took this stuff seriously. God put those authorities in power. As long as they don't ask us to violate our higher obligation to God's kingdom, then it's not our business to tell the state what to do. In fact, sometimes the state has to kill so we don't have to, right? That's traditional Mennonite thinking, right? And we don't prescribe any behavior to the state. We're citizens of a different kingdom. We have a wide gulf between the kingdom of the state and our world, and as long as they don't try to force us to do those evil things, the state has been empowered by God to do those things. Now, this teaching of non-resistance was held more deeply in different Mennonite groups. It was held more deeply among the Swiss South Germans, Eastern Mennonites here in the South Central Plains. Some of you came from historical trajectories in which your ancestors literally were a state within a state in what is today Ukraine, and you came here in the 1870s, 1880s. Your ancestors did with a much greater sense of institutional autonomy and validity. You built institutions. This was the first Mennonite college in the United States, Bethel College. Goes back to what, 1871? 77? 18, sorry, okay, sorry. And fine, I mean, we can talk, well, if we had endless time, we could talk nuances and subtleties, but look, that teaching still served as a general break on Mennonite social and political involvement until the mid-20th century, and that's when it began to change, and the walls came down, right? And what I want to do is I want to go back to that moment with you when the walls came down and Mennonites began to change their traditional stances, right, and began to question this two-kingdom theology. And I'll talk about that moment now. It was a key moment primarily because of a specific development, namely the Second World War, and then a larger development, this long-term process of acculturation that was breaking down those walls, okay? Now, World War II is, in my mind, one of the great watershed periods in American history. We are a different nation because of the war. So many of the post-war developments, the civil rights struggle, the women's movement, the demographic shift to the Sun Belt, the construction of a warfare state, a nuclear weapons state, the change in American foreign policy. So many of the seeds for modern American life were laid in the war. And it was a great watershed period for American Mennonites. They were a people of peace, committed to a nation of total war. They knew they'd be involved. And the key development for them was something called civilian public service. All right, no, I'm serious, my slide, I missed my slide. Here's traditional Mennonite non-resistance by one of its great articulators. All right, Mennonite historian, man named John Horsch. This is why I don't do PowerPoint, I missed the slides. All right, so let's talk about civilian public service. You all are peace people now in the Second World War. You think that war is wrong and it's evil, but now your nation is going to war. So what do you want for yourselves? What do you need? Particularly if we go back 20 years earlier to a time in which a previous generation, your parents' generation, you suffered immense persecution, particularly here in the Southern Plains, for pacifist principles during World War I. Immense persecution. Tabor's administration building up in flames. Peace Christians, German-speaking pacifists, were mobbed and torched and, right. That's the recent legacy. So what do you want now? Your nation's gearing up for war again. What do you want? CO status. You want CO status. You want some way of legitimating your dissent, right, in a meaningful way. You want that status to be protected. And by the way, that's not protected in the U.S. Constitution. You're aware of this. It's not an automatic thing. It's an indulgence, said the director of the Selective Service Program, Louis Hershey. It's an indulgence. And you know that, by the way, if you're a pacifist Christian, you'll need to probably put together a file, all right, that can prove your sincerity of your convictions. I'm not trying to do any Halloween stick. I can't imagine a draft happening again, really, no matter who's president. But you know that it's an automatic thing. And it doesn't, by the way, respect those of you who are non-pacifists. If you think, geez, I would fight in World War II, say, that meets my criteria as a just war, but I wouldn't fight in another war, right? The government will not recognize the validity of that position. It won't recognize the validity of a just war Christian refusing to fight. It's called selective conscience objection, and that's not recognized. Yeah, tangent, I'm sorry. You want CO status. You want some way of having your consciences respected. You don't want a repeat of World War I, right? And you want, moreover, none of you parachuted in from Mars, right? You're American citizens. Ideally, what do you want of us? What kind of CO program would you want? Yeah, some kind of alternative service to show that you want to sacrifice for your country too. You're patriotic, right? None of you just want to check out. And because of that, there were important grounds for dissent of this arrangement. I'll talk about those in a minute. What does the state want? What does the government want? CPS was a compromise. It was a negotiated thing. By the way, how it was negotiated? Did you know this? Mennonites, after World War I, said, we're not going to get caught flat-footed again. They sent representatives. One was from here, Henry Fast, right? A very important Mennonite leader in the Second World War. Albert Gaddert, right? Bethel people. Sent them to Washington, D.C., where they engaged with public officials, right? Today we would call that engagement. Lobbying is what we would call, but they, with Quakers took the lead, right? And they helped produce this thing, all right? What did the government want? They want to keep them quiet. They want to keep them, here's legitimate people who are against the war, keep them quiet so they don't obstruct the war effort, but you got to legitimate conscience. If you simply engage in repression and squash dissent, i.e. the World War I model, it kind of makes a mockery of all the things you tell your soldiers they're fighting for. You want to legitimate stands for consciousness, right? But you want them out of the way. So CPS is perfect. It gets 12,000. World War II CO, 16 million people were drafted. About 12,000 were legitimated as conscientious objectors. And you get them off in the bushes, right? Digging fire trails and the smoke jumpers. People clamored, these COs clamored to be smoke jumpers. They clamored to parachute into forest fires because they wanted to show their determination to sacrifice for their country, right? And it wasn't just guys, all right? Women, they weren't drafted then, though if there is a draft, you certainly will be today, and you'll actually be put in combat, you women. There'll be no gender deferments, and neither will there be student deferments, because the obvious class injustice that creates. College kids don't have to go to war. Guess who goes to fight, right? Same folks who are there now. It's a backdoor draft. It's poorer people, all right, or people with less opportunities. Women wanted too, and they volunteered in the mental hospitals. Men and women went into the mental hospitals in World War II because they were clamoring, give us more meaningful work. We're out here raking leaves when the world's on fire, all right? So look, it's a little negotiating thing. And that's one factor that begins to break the walls down, all right? Let me talk about another development. I am cognizant of my time, and I got like 15 minutes left. So a long process, that's the short term. The long process is a process of acculturation. And I mean, honestly, I wrote a book about this stuff once, and so it's very complex. But you just think for yourself, okay, why does this happen? Technology is one, right? The amazing technological developments of mid-20th century America, the telephone, the radio, the car, the tractor, the truck, movies, TV, later on the World Wide Web, the personal computer. It brings the world into your living rooms. And all of those break down the walls, particularly for isolated religious people like Mennonites who'd been able to follow their own God in their own quiet way for centuries by remaining isolated on the farm, right? And World War II, of course, is a massive acculturating agent, takes thousands of young people, young COs, scatters them around the world in various places, right? The war ushered in a revolution in American agriculture in particular. We went from a farm labor surplus in the 1930s, think of Tom Joads and Okies and John Steinbeck's Joads, to a farm labor shortage in the 1940s. There wasn't enough people to get crops in. So it was World War II, agricultural historians tell us, that ushered in the chemical revolution on the farm and the massive speed up in the farm mechanization, right? And as a result, I mean, it takes, within a few years, farming completes its transformation to a big business. And I suspect here, I'm not just talking, Mandarin or something to you. Some of you are farm kids who know in your bones what this meant. I got statistics. An economist, Bethel College economist named Lloyd Spalding, produced numbers for churches around here. In 10 years, 1946 to 56, the number of farmers in the congregation of Tabor Mennonite Church, does Tabor Mennonite Church in Newton still exist? Tabor Mennonite Church? Yeah, okay, sure. One number of farmers there went from 62 to 48%. Number of farmers at Bethel Mennonite Church in Inman, Kansas, not far from here, Inman, went from 70 to 34%. The Alexanderville Church, anyone from Alexanderville Church in Gossel? All right, a few of you. The number of farmers in your congregation went from 63 to 38% in 10 years. All right, and farm acreage is going up. These are those things expensive? I don't know. I grew up in LA, okay, but my sense is probably right. It takes a lot of capital to get started. All right. So for Mennonite leaders, look, this is important data for a lot of reasons, but again, arguably, Mennonites for centuries had allowed on the power inherent in an isolated rural ethno-religious community to socialize their young people and to maintain group norms, right? When the church is your center of not just your religious life, but of your social life, your ethnic life, your cultural life, your political life, then the church has a lot of influence in your life, and your pastor in particular has a lot of power. Fair enough? But as those walls begin to break down, that power begins to dissipate, and this created a crisis for Mennonite leadership during the war. And also, the adherence of young people to basic inherent group beliefs like non-resistance begins to fragment. And they know this because they quickly realized we have a problem. Let's figure out who's doing what when it comes to the military draft, right? Mennonite Central Committee did some surveys. They did draft census data. That data is at Goshen. Actually, it's probably been moved now to Elkhart. It's fascinating rich data. And so let's look at this is what they found out, and they look at the draft census data in World War II. All right? 1A is military person, military guy. Okay, these were men. All right? 1AO was non-combatants, which is to say stretcher bearers and medics, et cetera. And that's not a position the Mennonite Church acknowledged as legitimate. The Seventh-day Adventists did, all right, which is why a huge number of medics in World War II were Seventh-day Adventists. But for Mennonites, no, that's just, it's like being a teetotaler, but also in serving as a bartender, they said. I mean, they didn't really use that metaphor, but given Mennonites. But no, you can't, you know. And 4E would have been the draft. Those would have been COs, all right, conscientious objectors, all right? So you look at all this, and you got MCs and GCs there. If you're a Mennonite leader, and that data comes in, and again, they did a survey of pastors and asked the pastors to account for what other young men were doing, and the pastors had to then account for how they screwed up, right? Again, the methodology is questionable, and recently there's been new studies come out that maybe the farmer percentage was understated because of farm deferments. Fine, but if you're a Mennonite leader and you see that stuff coming in, you analyze those results, why is that a problem? Because in the GC church, only 28% of your men are obeying this ancient church precept of non-resistance. 2/3 of the guys are going into the army, right? I mean, that's a crisis. And then, you know, they broke it down, and they broke it down by age, occupation, and educational levels, right? And then it becomes a little more interesting. And for me, a social story, this is like Disneyland, right? This is great stuff. You want to take a wild guess at the most common occupation of the CO guys? Farmers, absolutely, because that included the Amish, right? And the most common educational level of the CO guys? 8th grade. In part because it didn't include the Amish, but also Mennonite college students were disproportionately pulling the CO, they weren't going to COs because of the effect of places like Bethel or Bluffton or Goshen, right? Or Eastern Mennonite School, all right? How about the occupation of the GIs? Disproportionately, they were what? Want to take a wild guess? Factory workers, right? People who left the community, got out of the factory. Educational levels. You want to take a guess at the most common educational level of a GI? High school, absolutely high school. Because the public high school was a secularizing agent. You go away from the community, you meet non-Mennonite friends, you have a non-Mennonite girlfriend, you know, whatever. It happens. I've heard that happens. And, you know, you connect to non-Mennonite peer networks. All right, so church leaders who digest all this stuff, I mean, what are their solutions? You want to take a wild guess at what they do after the war? Put all this together, we have a crisis, right? We got to fix this. So guess what they built after the war? Large numbers of Mennonite high schools. Huge numbers, right? Again, the walls are coming down, and we have to strengthen the walls. They also, particularly and this is not, I don't think, a GC thing, east here, but here, out in the Meadows where I lived, and they don't do this much either, though. Sometimes these people in the mall, right, in Lima, because there are some, they reinforced the plain dress, right? They made rules, and Lancaster County had a huge, thick rule book until it collapsed in the 1960s. There's massive lay resistance. You all know about the power of numbers, right? You know about political organizing 101. As an individual, you're a zero, they'll squash you. But if the entire bulk of you got up and left en masse right now, what could a net do? I mean, I'm not trying to encourage this, right? But right, stay here. Sorry. You don't show up for finals week, what are they going to do to you, right? Find the ringleaders and get them. But no. So actually in the 1960s, people just, these bishops were confronted by all these fine young Mennonite girls who wanted to be baptized, but they cut their hair, right? And this guy here on his wedding day, poor guy, he's wearing a plain coat, right? He's wearing a plain coat. But what's he tucked in there? Necktie, right? Which is naughty, it's worldly, right? So, you do this. That didn't work either because of mass lay resistance, right? Look, once the war showed that the forces of acculturation were breaking down the walls that Mennonites erected between themselves and society, they tried to put the walls back up, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Mennonite high schools work, but it turns out Mennonite high schools are not what they were in the 1950s, right? They've changed. A huge percentage of students of those high schools aren't Mennonites at all, right? And they're engaged in career prep and college prep courses, which, fine with me, right? Send them to Bethel, send them to Bluffton, great. Though in many cases, I think we're too liberal for them today. We're ahead of ourselves here. I want to push us on to theology. I want you to read this guy. This is someone, folks, that you just have to know, particularly you non-pacifists. This guy, all right? And one of the leading American theologians, a guy who was writing his treatises from England. He was married to a British woman in the 1930s. One of the 20th century dominant theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr, right? And emerged as one of the most dominant public theologians of 20th century America. He was a pacifist in the early 30s when he broke with Hitler. He was writing his analyses from England about the time of the Blitz. All right, he's married to a British woman, and he gave one of the most stunning, trenchant, tough critiques of Christian pacifism. And those of you who aren't Mennonites, you want to explain why you're not a pacifist, right? Yeah, you ought to read Niebuhr. And those of us who are Christian pacifists need to read Niebuhr too, because we need to be engaged with ideas. So here's what the thing is about Niebuhr. There was one kind of pacifist that he liked. Read this. I'll give you the longer quote. This is from a Christian Century article called Japan and the Christian Conscience in 1937. He says, "It's a good thing, therefore, that there should be a group in the church which seeks to symbolize the absolute ideal of love. It may remind us of the perils of our compromises in critical periods. But let such a group disavow its illusion that it has another and better way of establishing social justice than the way of social struggle." Now listen to what he's saying. "Let it desist from sentimental alternatives that are suggesting that Christian statesmen should go visit Japan and soften the purpose of Japanese imperialism or go make nice with Hitler. Let it send that stuff, forget that stuff. Let it be frankly irresponsible in the social struggle as the best aesthetics of Christian history were. Let it admit that the problem of social justice is something that does not concern it directly. Let it admit, as Mennonite pacifists have admitted, that the mystery of social evil is too great to be solved by human moral action, since all action is not as pure as it imagines itself to be. Let it admit, let such pacifism realize that it is a form of asceticism, and as such, it is a parasite on the sins of the rest of us who maintain government and relative social peace and relative social justice." What's Niebuhr saying? Oh, I love this stuff, man. You gotta read Niebuhr today. What's he saying? Who does he like? He likes us little Mennonites, doesn't he? Because you have nothing to say to the social struggle. You have nothing to say to you nice little hobbit-like people, go out there in the bushes and dig fire trails, right? And get out the way, right? Brush your toes, and go out there in the bushes and do your thing. And because you don't have any illusions that you're relevant at all to the social struggle. The rest of us people got to roll up our sleeves and do the dirty work of maintaining order in an evil world when there are evildoers who are doing great evil. And you've got nothing to say about that. Of course, you've got to admit, you're parasites on us, right? You're parasites, just admit it, right? Okay, if you're a Mennonite pacifist, how do you respond to that stuff? Well, in many cases, you don't. Some have said, yeah, right on, Reinhold, right? You maintain order, you people, so we don't have to. You kill, so we don't have to. But there are other people, look, this stung. No one likes to be called a parasite, particularly because, of course, the walls are coming down, and you're good Americans. No, we don't want that. In fact, they were begging to be sent into war zones. Robert Kreider, whose name some of you knew. Robert Kreider was on his way in the war zone. They were going to go and do works of reconciliation in a war zone until the government said, no, this isn't a good idea, let people like that in the war zone. And they called him back, right? Pastor Ryder, right? Don't put Robert Kreider into the war, right? And they got to work in the domestic United States. So they went to Puerto Rico. They went to the Deep South and built sanitary privies. They went into mental hospitals. They wanted to smoke jump. Show us a way we can contribute, but we can't engage in the ultimate way of showing our worthiness of full citizenship, namely, we can't do the army. All right, well, there's a couple of answers that Mennonites came up with, and there's this guy Hirschberger, all right, and he said, right, that, okay, fine, we don't do politics, right? He's a professor of history. He's a tremendous Mennonite intellectual. He was a guy who cared deeply about justice and social struggle and wrestled with these issues in a way that very few Mennonites at the time were doing it. Just a classic text that some of, I think, your parents and grandparents probably still have on their shelves because it was all given to them as young people, right? War, Peace, and Non-Resistance, published in 1944. And he said, the mission of non-resistant Christians is not a political one. It's a curative one. What we do is bring healing to society by simple acts of mercy. We're colonies of heaven. We don't demand justice, we just do it. We just model it, right? But, the walls had come down. And increasingly, Hirschberger's answer proved inadequate. All right? So, after the war, Mennonites did their best to flesh this out, and arguably this became, how much time I got? 5 minutes left in that? Yeah, 5 minutes. God help me. All right, so arguably, this became a centerpiece of a post-war Mennonite identity. We're going to do that curative mission. And look, I am not being condescending or unappreciative of this. My daughter right now is in Alaska with Mennonite Mission Network. She spends her day working at a soup kitchen and distributing the meals to Anchorage's poor. I'm proud of her. She's expressing the vision of my church, and I am grateful for her witness. And those of you who are considering Mennonite voluntary service, I say all power to you, or Lutheran Volunteer Corps, Jesuit Voluntary Corps, or Mennonite Central Committee, all power to you. That's a marvelous expression of Christian commitment, and I have immense respect. Actually, myself, I went and worked for Habitat for a year in 1981. We had 11 affiliates, and I showed with the bachelor's degree. They made me director of development. That's how desperate Habitat was for volunteers in 1981. And yeah, absolutely. But that became a Mennonite expression of what Hirschberg's taught. Mennonite disaster service was born here in Kansas in the early 50s. Born from these churches around here. Rains came, floods came, and they said, it was CPS vets, right? Men and women who dove into that. Mennonite mental health services. Mennonites in those wretched facilities worked a revolution in the care of America's mentally ill, right? And that is a tremendous expression of what Hirschberg was talking about. I don't mean to diminish or demean it, but still people said it's not enough. That's too much like what Niebuhr said, right? And I don't have time to talk about the conscription institutes, but I just want to give you one more expression of developments in the post-war years. In 1950, and this is November 1950, and you know about American history, you know what was going on in November 1950. It was in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. President Truman took advantage of that moment. Russia was having a sned to UN, couldn't block it. He got the UN to approve a joint UN effort to overturn the North Korean invasion of South Korea. Basically, this meant a second American land war in Asia for the second time in 5 years, and World War II vets were rushed over there. And in November 1950, we had gotten too close to the Chinese border, and 300,000 volunteers of the Chinese army came pouring across the Yalu River. And at this moment, the American military was suffering its worst retreat in its history. It was being pushed back to the very corner of the Korean Peninsula during the height of the Korean War, all right? And Mennonites from all these different groups met at Winona Lake, Indiana, and they produced a fascinating statement, and we call it the Winona Lake Declaration. And you can see the kind of ferment that's underway, all right? And they talked about, listen to this, right? Our love and ministry must go out to all, regardless of race or condition, within or without the brotherhood, whether friend or foe, and must seek to bring the gospel, all its benefits to everyone. Race or class prejudice must not be found among us. You know what happened to these CO people? They were sent off to the Deep South, and they were erecting sanitary toilets across Deep South. They were sent to Gulfport, Mississippi, and they encountered people of color, and that was a new thing for most whitey Mennonites. And the Klan told them, knock it off. Can't you deal with people as human beings, right? No, an incredible transformation had begun to occur, all right? And World War II and CPS plunged Mennonites into places of need that they never yet encountered and began to think about racism. What has racism done to American society? Are we guilty of that? Right? A lot of these Mennonites had never seen people of color. They never interacted with them, and they treated them as human beings. And the Klan said, knock it off. Don't you know anything about the way things are done down here in the South? So listen to what the Winona Lake Declaration said. So if more for you've got these people, you've got these CO people. Here are two Bethel people for you. Winfield Fretz, Robert Kreider. Robert Kreider was there. He was a CPS administrator, and he was there. And he said, look, don't give me this thing. We don't tell a state what to do. We did in 1940. We went to Washington, D.C. when our necks were on the line, right? And the draft was starting. We went to Washington, D.C., and guess what we did? We lobbied. We lobbied. Give me a break. We tell the state what to do when it was our neck in the sling. well, shouldn't we then, and this is his gendered language, if he was here, he'd be embarrassed, but, right? Shouldn't we then voice the Christian conscience of the state when other groups of men met not of our brotherhood also experience injustice and misery? Or your sociology professor, Winfield Fretz, Bluffton grad, he was a beaver, right? And, we've had our non-resistant doctrine vacuum-packed in Mennonite cultural walls, and those walls have come down, and we can't go back. All right, we can't go back. And a whole new Mennonite way of engaging the state. Well, this is what they, all right, what do they say there? I know I'm out of time on that. Okay, one more minute, okay, pal? And, ironically, it was Hirschberg who paved the way for this stuff. He had that little prophetic qualifier tucked in there, right? God has set the state, right, and where it's supposed to be. Fine, Romans 13, we're all for that. But we must judge everything in light of God's word. We must acknowledge our obligation to what's the powers that be of the righteousness that God requires of all people, even those in government. What's the breakthrough there? Yeah, with change of state. Right? Fine, you want to make theological prescriptions? In God we trust, call yourself a Christian state? Fine. Well, then here's what God says about your behavior. Right? Fine. You want to talk theology? Yeah, let's do that. Right? And Jim Crow is a disgrace and a shame and an abomination in the eyes of God, and you got to get rid of it. And okay, fine. Having said that, Mennonites were mostly in the back seat of that struggle. Okay, it was others who took the lead. Although people like Guy Hirschberg, to his credit, were out in front, right? And so was Elmer Neufeld. One more quote to end this. One more Bethel guy. All right, I don't have a slide for him. All right, but one more Bethel guy. This is where this is going. This is a guy from Inman, Kansas, Elmer Neufeld, who graduated here from Bethel, served in CPS, and worked in Washington, D.C. as his church's representative to the CO agency, the organization that oversaw the CO programs. When I was hired at Bluffton, he was my president. I said, geez, whatever happens to this job interview out here, at least I got to meet Elmer Neufeld. I mean, I'd read his correspondence going back for decades. And he actually was my president. He was a good man. And he began, this is at a big Mennonite study conference on the common good, 1957, and Christian responsibility to the state in Chicago, big study conference. And he tells a story of an army colonel he met. That's what the colonel said. He said, we like you Mennonites. You Mennonites are fine folk to get along with. We like you. It'd be nice if there were people like you. We like you. You're nice little people. But you do nothing about sin, about social wrong, about corruption of government, about international tensions. You don't do it. You go off in the bushes and dig some more fire trails, right? And Neufeld said it made him wonder whether, quote, perhaps we have used a legitimate and important teaching, separation from the world, to escape responsibilities that are clearly ours within the gospel of Christ, unquote. It was clear to him what those concerns were. He said, and how they ought to change the Mennonite capacity to speak to the common good. He said, when we are thoroughly motivated by the love of Christ and the cross, when we actually take our neighbor's interest as seriously as we take our own, our concerns will appropriately find expression in actions that do have political relevance. Elmer gets the last word, and I did leave a few minutes for questions. I apologize for going over my time. Thank you all very much.
We have 2 minutes for questions. Is there a burning question? Yes, sorry, that's all right.
I was disrespectful to you as an audience. I was supposed to leave you more time. I apologize. Yes, sir. Any questions for me? Lunch will still be there, I promise, in 10 minutes.
Here's one.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for speaking.
Thanks for having me.
So I was wondering, in these protests against the war, were there any attempts to justify their position by non-Christian rationale, like to other people, or would that be a debasement of their principles?
Not in the early 40s, but by the early 50s, Mennonites began to make those shifts. In 1952, Harold Bender of Goshen College went before the United States government was beginning to put together universal military conscription, the Korean War draft. And it was talking about doing what the Russians have, total, everyone serves, right? Mennonites didn't like this idea. So Bender went before House committees to testify, and he made that's an excellent question, by the way. He said, look, we're against the draft because of what it means for Americans. This is bad for us as a country. And we think about that. Harold Bender? Wow. Right, who was actually dragging his feet in some of this stuff. But as Harold Bender, no, he didn't talk about, leave us Mennonites out. That's what they had been saying up to this point. Leave us Mennonites out. No, he says the draft is bad for everybody. Right, and that's indicative of the kind of change that begins to get made. Look, those walls come down. We can't just look out for our own necks anymore. Great question. Any more questions?
Hi, thank you for your interesting speech. My name is Lennart Storch. I'm from Germany. I'm an exchange student. And before I came to Bethel, I had not known Mennonites. And I have one question about the Second Amendment, the right to own a gun here in the States. Because for me, as a German, it's a little bit frightened. I don't like violence. And I try to understand the people. I speak with students here at supper about these themes. And I also find Mennonite students which say, okay, I'm pro the Second Amendment, and I learned here that Mennonites are against violence. And for me, it's a little bit a contradiction. What is your opinion, or is there an official Mennonite opinion?
Okay. Well, I can't speak to the second part. Look, I feel for you, man. I grew up in L.A. I didn't know Mennonites either from a hole in the ground, honestly. And the whole Second Amendment thing, I grew up in Pasadena. It wasn't a gun thing. But look, many Americans really like guns. What can I say? And it's not my thing, but look, I like to fish. And I can understand how people like to go hunting. Some people like to go target practice. Those are legitimate, useful. It doesn't do much for me, right? But other people are really into this. And I think there's a whole culture of gun ownership and gun rights that is facilitated by groups like a very effective lobbying effort, the National Rifle Association, right? And I acknowledge the legitimacy of those positions. For me, I don't understand why that culture has a hard time putting any limits on that. Why they think we need to have military-style assault weapons to kill Bambi. I mean, I don't understand, why you need that, right? So I can't really explain that, except it's deeply imbued in this culture, particularly that is especially found in rural America, especially among elderly people. Apparently NRA is in a major state of freakout right now because the average age of gun owners is getting older and older and older, right? But I would say keep talking to your friends and do it, of course, as I assume you will, in a respectful way. Help me understand this gun thing that, honestly, as a kid who grew up in LA and I've been living in these college towns all these years, I don't really get it either. And I can understand how our European friends would roll their eyes and go, what's with these Americans? I mean, what is with that? So explain it to him, and that's a legitimate question. I don't get why we can't have reasonable limits on these things. It's best I could do. Sorry.
Let's thank our speaker again.